All right, Reddit, buckle up because this is going to be a long one and I need to get this off my chest. What I overheard 3 months ago changed everything, and what I've been planning since then is finally starting to unfold. Let me give you some background first. I'm Franklin, 42, married to Mary for 15 years. We have a teenage daughter, Ivy, who's 17. Mary's sister, Carol, visits constantly, and I mean constantly, like she treats our house as her personal hotel. Her mother, Laura, practically lives with us half the time, always has some excuse about why she can't stay at her own apartment. I work in corporate finance for a mid-sized firm, make around 6 figures, own our house outright after paying it off early, and have been the sole provider for years, while Mary stays home claiming she needs to focus on being a mother. The thing is, Mary stopped actually mothering years ago. Ivy raises herself while Mary spends her days shopping with Carol, getting her nails done, or having long lunches with her divorced friends who fill her head with ideas about how much better life could be without a husband. I come home every day to a house where I'm treated like a walking credit card who occasionally gets to sleep in the master bedroom. Here's what you need to understand. I haven't been some clueless husband. For the past 8 years, I've noticed things. Small comments about my appearance, my job, my personality. Mary started treating me differently after her divorce lawyer friend Janet started hanging around their girls' nights. This woman has been divorced 3 times and apparently sees breaking up marriages as some kind of hobby. Carol would make these little digs about how I wasn't ambitious enough, how other husbands bought their wives nicer things, how I was too boring and predictable. Ivy started rolling her eyes whenever I spoke and acting like I was some embarrassing burden she had to tolerate. The disrespect escalated gradually. Mary began forgetting to include me in family decisions. She'd plan vacations with Carol and only mention them to me when the tickets were already booked. She stopped cooking, stopped cleaning, stopped doing anything that resembled being a partner in this marriage. But she sure as hell never stopped spending my money. Designer purses, expensive dinners with her sister, spa days that cost more than most people's rent. Carol moved back to town 2 years ago after her latest relationship imploded, and suddenly she was at our house every single day. She'd comment on everything from how I dressed to what I ate to how I talked, made jokes about how Mary settled for someone so ordinary. Laura joined in, always comparing me unfavorably to Mary's high school boyfriend, who became a surgeon. The three of them would sit in my living room, drinking wine I paid for, talking about me like I wasn't even human. But the real turning point was last Christmas. I worked extra hours to afford the expensive gifts Mary had been hinting about for months. A designer watch for her, a new laptop for Ivy, gift cards for Carol and Laura. Know what I got? A generic tie from the clearance rack and a card that just said Franklin. Not even love, Mary, or from your family. Just my name. Like I was some distant relative they felt obligated to acknowledge. That's when I knew for certain they were planning something. You don't treat someone that poorly unless you're already emotionally checked out and planning your exit strategy. But 3 months ago, on a Thursday evening in June, everything became crystal clear. I was in the kitchen setting the table for dinner when I heard them in the living room. They thought I was still upstairs working in my office, but I'd come down early to help with dinner like I always do. Mary was talking to Carol about how she had to get drunk just to let me touch her, calling me her personal ATM instead of a husband. Carol was encouraging her to keep bleeding me dry and then dump what she called my pathetic self. The divorce lawyer was apparently ready and waiting. Then Ivy chimed in asking if she could film when I found out, wanting to title it something about watching my life implode. Mary added that she deserved an Oscar for 10 years of faking love for me. Laura called from the kitchen saying she should have married that doctor instead of this worthless nobody, meaning me. Ivy giggled about how when I was gone, they'd get the house and my pension. I stood there listening to every word. But here's the thing. Reddit. I wasn't shocked. I was vindicated. Because for the past 8 years, I've been preparing for exactly this moment. See, I'm not some naive husband who just discovered his family hates him. I've known for years that Mary married me for financial security, not love. I've watched Ivy learn from her mother that men are just providers to be manipulated. I've seen Carol's jealousy over my success compared to her string of failed relationships. And Laura has never hidden her disappointment that her daughter didn't marry someone more prestigious. So while they thought they were playing some long game, I've been playing an even longer one. Every major financial decision I've made in the past 8 years has been with this eventual betrayal in mind. Every legal document, every investment, every account, all of it structured for the day they'd try to destroy me. When Mary stopped working 5 years ago under the pretense of focusing on Ivy, I immediately restructured our finances. I set up separate business accounts, created an LLC for our rental property income, and moved my retirement funds into protected vehicles they couldn't touch. While Mary was busy planning spa days with her sister, I was busy planning for the inevitable day she'd try to take everything I'd worked for. I started documenting their behavior patterns, not in some creepy stalker way, but I kept track of their spending, their lies about where they were going, their treatment of me in front of others. Mary told people at Ivy's school events that I was too cheap to pay for family vacations. Meanwhile, I was paying for her and Carol to go to weekend retreats every other month. She'd complain to neighbors about how I never bought her nice jewelry, while wearing the $2,000 earrings I'd gotten her for our anniversary. The psychological games got worse, too. Mary would ask my opinion on something, then immediately dismiss whatever I said and do the opposite. She'd make plans for family dinners and then cancel them last minute to go out with Carol instead. She started sleeping in the guest room, claiming I snored too loud, but I could hear her on the phone late at night talking to her divorced friends about exit strategies and asset division. Ivy learned from watching her mother that treating me with contempt was acceptable. She'd ask for money for school activities and then spend it on clothes and makeup. When I'd question her about it, Mary would defend her and tell me I was being too controlling. They had this whole system where they'd gang up on me anytime I tried to set reasonable boundaries or expectations. The house they think they're going to get? It's protected in ways they can't imagine. My pension they're already counting. They have zero claim to most of it. The comfortable lifestyle they've grown accustomed to, built on foundations they never bothered to understand. But I didn't react that night. I went back upstairs, finished my work, and came down for dinner like nothing happened. I ate with them, listened to Mary complain about her day, helped Ivy with her homework, and was the same reliable Franklin they've all taken for granted for years. The next morning, I started implementing plans I'd been developing for nearly a decade. Small moves at first, nothing they'd notice immediately. I began redirecting automatic payments, adjusting account access, and activating legal protections I'd quietly put in place years ago. You see, while Mary was busy playing house with her sister and mother, I was busy learning everything I could about asset protection and divorce law. I read every case study, consulted with attorneys on hypothetical scenarios, and structured my finances like I was expecting a war. Because I was. I opened accounts at different banks under business names they'd never heard of. I moved high-value assets into protected trusts. I established residency requirements and waiting periods for certain investments that would make them untouchable in a divorce. Every bonus, every raise, every windfall got filtered through these protective structures before a penny ever hit our joint accounts. The beautiful part is that I did all of this completely legally and transparently. I'm not hiding assets or committing fraud. I'm just exercising my rights as the person who earned the money to protect it from people who view me as nothing more than a source of funding for their lifestyle. Mary has no idea that the joint accounts she thinks she has access to are structured as revocable trusts where I'm the sole beneficiary, and she only has spending privileges that I can revoke at any time. Carol doesn't know that the credit cards she occasionally borrows have spending alerts that go directly to my private phone, and that I've been building a record of her unauthorized usage. Ivy is oblivious to the fact that her college fund is in my name only with specific conditions for release that require her to maintain a relationship with me. And Laura is completely unaware that the house she's been treating as her second home is owned by an LLC I created 6 years ago, making her a tenant at will rather than a family member with any legal rights to the property. Over the past 3 months, I've been systematically dismantling the financial framework that supports their lifestyle without them noticing. The beauty is that everything I'm doing is completely legal. I'm just removing access to assets that were always mine to begin with. I've started redirecting their automatic subscriptions and memberships to accounts they don't monitor. Mary's gym membership, Carol's streaming services that I somehow ended up paying for, Ivy's music and app subscriptions, all moved to a business account where I can track every expense and cut access instantly if needed. They haven't noticed yet because the charges still go through, but now I have complete control over when they stop. I've also been strategically reducing their credit limits and removing them as authorized users on certain accounts. Again, all legal since the accounts are in my name, but it means their spending power is slowly shrinking without them realizing why. Mary tried to book another spa weekend with Carol last week, and her card was declined. She called the bank confused, and they told her the account holder had reduced the available credit. She asked me about it, and I just said I was being more careful with our finances because of market volatility. The psychological aspect of this is fascinating. They're so used to my money being available that they never questioned whether it always would be. Mary hasn't worked in 5 years and has no idea how to manage finances beyond spending what someone else earned. Carol has been unemployed more often than employed and sees borrowing money as a normal way of life, Laura expects her daughter's husband to support her like she's entitled to it. Ivy has never held a job or learned the value of money because everything has always been handed to her. None of them have any concept of what it takes to maintain the lifestyle they've grown accustomed to. They think money just appears in accounts by magic. They have no idea about budgeting, investing, tax planning, or asset protection. I've deliberately kept them financially illiterate because I knew this day would come. But the real genius part? They still think they're in control. Mary keeps dropping hints about how unhappy she is, probably building up to asking for a separation. Carol keeps encouraging her sister's complaints about me. Ivy continues treating me like an inconvenience she can't wait to be rid of. Laura keeps making comments about how I'm not good enough for her daughter. They have no idea that I'm already 10 steps ahead of whatever timeline they're working with. Every conversation they have, thinking I can't hear them, just gives me more information about their plans. Every nasty comment they make just proves I'm doing the right thing. Yesterday, Mary actually had the nerve to suggest we should start couples counseling because she feels like we're growing apart. The irony is unreal. She wants to go to therapy to work on a marriage she's actively planning to destroy for financial gain. I told her I'd think about it, but what I'm really thinking about is how satisfying it's going to be when they realize that the man they've been calling worthless and pathetic has been 3 moves ahead of them this entire time. The best part is coming, though. See, they're planning something for next month. I can tell by their increased whispering and the way they stop talking whenever I enter a room. They think they're being subtle, but after 15 years of Mary's terrible acting, I can read her like a book. I've also been quietly documenting everything for months now. Not obsessively, but I keep records of their behavior, their spending, their lies about where the money goes. When Mary told her mother I refused to pay for Ivy's senior pictures, I had the receipt showing I'd paid $800 for a premium package. When Carol told her friends I was too cheap to help with her car repairs, I had bank records showing I'd paid for her transmission replacement and 3 oil changes. Their gaslighting doesn't work when you have documentation. Their lies fall apart when you have evidence. Their manipulation fails when you're prepared for it. Whatever they're planning, they're going to discover that the reliable, passive Franklin they've been taking advantage of doesn't exist anymore. Actually, he never existed. I've just been waiting for them to show their true colors completely, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This is just the beginning of what's going to be a very interesting few months for Mary, Carol, Ivy, and Laura. I'll keep you updated as this unfolds because trust me, Reddit, what's coming next is going to make their little scheme look like amateur hour compared to what someone with actual financial knowledge and 8 years of preparation can accomplish. They wanted to play games with someone they thought was naive and passive. They're about to learn they picked the wrong opponent. Update 1. The comments on my last post predicted exactly what would happen. And let me tell you, it's been a wild couple of weeks since I posted. For those just joining, my wife Mary, her sister Carol, daughter Ivy, and mother-in-law Laura have been planning to divorce me and take everything I've worked for. What they don't know is that I've been preparing for this exact scenario for 8 years. So remember how I said they were planning something for this month? Well, last Friday evening, Mary finally pulled the trigger. The setup was so transparent it was almost insulting. She sent Ivy to stay overnight at a friend's house and asked Carol to take Laura shopping for the evening. She wanted us to be completely alone, which should have been my first red flag that this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. Mary had clearly rehearsed this whole thing. She started by sitting me down in the living room with this fake concerned expression and telling me she'd been doing a lot of thinking about our marriage. She said she felt like we'd grown apart over the years and that maybe we needed some time to figure out what we both really wanted. Classic divorce preparation language, right out of some manual her lawyer friend Janet probably gave her. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of just agreeing or getting defensive like the old Franklin would have, I decided to see how far she'd go with her act. I told her I was surprised to hear this, that I thought we'd been working through our problems together. I asked her what specifically made her feel like we were growing apart. Mary started listing off all these complaints about how I worked too much, how I didn't spend enough quality time with the family, how I was too focused on money and financial planning. The irony was unreal. She was criticizing me for the exact things that enabled her lifestyle. She complained that I never took her anywhere nice anymore, conveniently forgetting that I'd paid for her and Carol to go to Napa Valley just 2 months ago, while I stayed home with Ivy. Then she dropped the bomb. She said she thought we should try a trial separation, just for a few months, to give each other some space to think about what we really wanted. She'd already looked into a rental apartment across town and thought it would be good for me to experience living on my own again. I sat there listening to her pitch this separation like it was some mutual decision we were making together when I knew exactly what it really was. This was phase 1 of her exit strategy. get me out of the house, establish separate living arrangements, then file for divorce claiming irreconcilable differences and abandonment. But instead of getting angry or refusing, I surprised her. I told her that maybe she was right, that perhaps some time apart would help us both gain perspective on our relationship. I could see her trying to hide her excitement when I agreed so easily. She probably thought this was going exactly according to plan. Then I started asking practical questions about the logistics. How long did she think this separation should last? What would we tell Ivy? How would we handle the household expenses during this time? And here's where I started testing her real motivations. I suggested that since she was the one proposing the separation, maybe she should be the one to move out instead of me. After all, I reasoned, it would be less disruptive for Ivy if I stayed in the family home during this difficult transition. Mary's face went through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds. She clearly hadn't expected me to suggest that she be the one to leave. She backtracked quickly, saying that she thought it would be better for me to have the new experience, that change would be good for my personal growth. She was scrambling to make it sound like moving out was somehow a gift she was giving me, rather than what it really was, getting me away from my own assets. That's when I decided to push a little harder. I told her that if we were really going to do this separation properly, we should probably talk to lawyers about how to handle our finances during this period. Just to make sure everything was fair and legal, I said. You should have seen her face light up when I mentioned lawyers. Mary immediately jumped on that suggestion, saying she thought it was very mature of me to want to handle things properly. She even mentioned that her friend Janet had recommended an excellent family law attorney who specialized in helping couples navigate separations and divorces. What a coincidence, right? But then I dropped my own little bomb. I told her that I'd actually already spoken to an attorney myself, just to understand what our options were. This was true. I'd been consulting with legal experts for years about asset protection. Mary looked confused and asked when I'd had time to talk to a lawyer. I explained that I'd been thinking about our relationship problems for a while too, and that I'd wanted to understand what separation or divorce would mean for our family financially. I told her my attorney had given me some very interesting information about how assets are divided in our state, especially when one spouse has been the sole income earner for many years. Mary tried to look supportive, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She asked what exactly the lawyer had told me, so I shared some carefully selected facts about how pension rights work, how asset division gets calculated, and how courts handle situations where one spouse has significantly out-earned the other during the marriage. What I didn't tell her was that my lawyer had helped me structure everything to be protected from exactly the scenario she was planning. I just let her think I was getting the same generic advice that most people get when they walk into a divorce attorney's office for the first time. The conversation continued for another hour, with Mary trying to sound supportive while clearly fishing for information about what I knew and what I was planning. She kept emphasizing how she wanted this to be amicable and fair to everyone involved. She talked about putting Ivy's needs first and making sure the separation didn't cause unnecessary financial hardship for the family. By the end of the night, we'd agreed that I would start looking for a temporary apartment and that we'd both consult with our respective attorneys about how to handle the legal and financial aspects of our separation. Mary seemed satisfied that everything was going according to her plan. But here's what she doesn't know. While she thinks she's maneuvering me into a vulnerable position, I'm actually moving into the final phase of my own plan. You see, I've been waiting for her to make this exact move because it triggers several legal protections I put in place years ago. The moment Mary initiated talk of separation, she activated clauses in our financial agreements that she doesn't even know exist. The joint accounts that she thinks she'll have access to during our separation, they automatically convert to my sole control if either party files for separation or divorce. The house that she's planning to keep, the LLC structure means she has no claim to it if she's the one who initiated the breakup of our marriage. Even better, I've been documenting everything. The conversation we had Friday night was recorded, legally, since it was in my own home, and I was a participant in the conversation. Her plan to manipulate me into moving out while she stays in the house is now evidence of her intent to defraud me of my assets. Over the weekend, Carol and Laura came by to help Mary process her feelings about our conversation. I made sure to be out of the house during their strategy session, but I have security cameras with audio recording throughout the main living areas. I installed them years ago after some break-ins in our neighborhood, and Mary never objected to them. Let's just say their weekend conversation was very illuminating. They spent hours discussing how to maximize Mary's financial settlement, how to present me as an absent and uncaring husband, and how to make sure Ivy would choose to live with Mary so she could claim child support. Carol was coaching Mary on what to say to make me look bad, and Laura was calculating how much money they thought they could get out of me. The best part was when they started talking about the timeline. They want to drag out the separation for at least 6 months to establish a pattern of us living apart. Then file for divorce claiming that I abandoned the family. Carol actually suggested that Mary should try to provoke me into doing something she could claim was abusive or threatening just to strengthen her position. They have no idea that every word of their planning session is documented. They think they're so clever, but they're actually building my case for me. This week, I've started the process of looking for apartments, just like Mary and I agreed. But I'm not just randomly searching. I'm specifically looking for places that fit into my larger strategy. I need somewhere that will serve my purposes when this all comes to a head. Meanwhile, Mary has been acting like the supportive wife who's sad about our marriage problems but committed to working through them in a healthy way. She's been extra affectionate, cooking dinner more often, and asking about my day. It's all part of her performance to look like the devoted wife who tried everything to save the marriage before reluctantly accepting that separation was necessary. But I can see right through it. This is the same woman who was laughing with her family about bleeding me dry and filming my life falling apart. The same woman who thinks I'm worthless and pathetic. She's just playing a role now because she needs to maintain her image as the victim of a failed marriage rather than the architect of its destruction. The really sick part is that Ivy is starting to play her role too. She's been more pleasant to me lately, actually engaging in conversations and even asking for help with her college application essays. But I know this is just part of the strategy. They want to establish that she has a good relationship with me, right now, so that when she inevitably chooses to live with Mary during the divorce, it looks like a thoughtful decision rather than the result of years of manipulation. Next week, I'm supposed to go look at apartments with Mary. She wants to help me find the perfect place for my new life as a separated man. What she doesn't realize is that this apartment hunting trip is going to be the beginning of her education about who she's really been married to all these years, because I'm not the naive, passive husband she thinks she's manipulating. I'm the guy who's been planning for this moment since the day I realized what kind of person I married. And phase 2 of my plan is about to begin. Stay tuned, Reddit, because what happens next is going to show Mary, Carol, Ivy, and Laura that they picked the wrong man to betray. Update 2. Reddit, you're not going to believe what happened this week. Remember how I said Mary wanted to help me apartment hunt? Well, that little trip turned into something she definitely wasn't expecting. The mask is starting to slip on both sides now, and things are getting intense. So Monday morning, Mary and I drove across town to look at apartments. She was in full supportive wife mode, talking about how this separation was really an opportunity for both of us to grow as individuals. She kept emphasizing how she wanted to make sure I found somewhere nice, somewhere I'd be comfortable during this transitional period in our lives. The first place we looked at was a decent one-bedroom in a complex near my office. Mary walked through it with me, pointing out the good points, asking about the lease terms, acting like the caring wife helping her husband through a difficult time. But I could see her calculating in her head. This place cost about $1,800 a month, which meant less money in the household budget for her to access. That's when I decided to test the waters a little. I told Mary that my lawyer had suggested I look at places that were a bit more upscale since I'd be living there for potentially a long time and I deserved to be comfortable. I suggested we look at some of the luxury apartments downtown that run about $4,000 a month. Mary's supportive smile flickered for just a second. She asked why I thought I needed something so expensive when this was supposed to be a temporary arrangement. I explained that my attorney had pointed out that the amount I spent on housing during our separation could set precedents for alimony calculations later. If I lived too modestly, it might suggest I didn't actually need much money to maintain my lifestyle. You should have seen the look on her face when she realized that me spending more money during our separation might actually hurt her financial position in a divorce. She tried to backtrack, saying that she just wanted me to be happy and comfortable, but I could see her starting to panic about the implications. Then I dropped the first real bomb. I told her that my lawyer had also advised me to document all of our current household expenses so we could establish baseline costs for maintaining our standard of living. I said I'd been going through our financial records from the past few years to create a comprehensive picture of our spending patterns. Mary asked what I'd found in those records. So I started listing off some interesting discoveries, like how much money Carol had been borrowing over the years, money that was never paid back, how the credit card she used for emergencies had been used for things like designer clothes and weekend trips that I was never told about, how certain household expenses had been inflated to cover personal purchases for her mother and sister. I explained that my attorney was particularly interested in these patterns because they suggested that our household income had been supporting more people than just our immediate family. This could be relevant for calculating what Mary would actually need for support during and after our divorce, since apparently she'd been managing fine while sharing our resources with Carol and Laura. Mary tried to explain that helping family was just part of being a good person, that Carol and Laura were going through difficult times and needed support. I agreed that helping family was admirable, but pointed out that using marital assets to support extended family without the other spouse's knowledge or consent could be legally problematic. By the time we had finished looking at apartments, Mary was noticeably less enthusiastic about this whole separation idea. She kept asking questions about what my lawyer had told me, what kind of timeline we were looking at, whether I really thought we needed to involve attorneys so heavily in what should be a simple separation. That evening, I overheard another strategy session in the living room. This time, the tone was very different from their previous confident planning meetings. Mary was explaining to Carol and Laura that I seemed to know a lot more about divorce law than they'd expected. Carol asked if I'd mentioned anything about their financial arrangements, and Mary had to admit that yes, I'd specifically brought up the money she'd been lending to family members. Laura was furious. She started ranting about how ungrateful I was, how she'd raised Mary to be generous and family-oriented, and now I was trying to use that against them. Carol was more practical. She asked whether they needed to be worried about having to pay back the money they'd borrowed over the years. That's when Mary dropped the real bombshell. She told them that, according to what I'd said, my lawyer was treating all the money they'd borrowed as gifts from the marital estate, which could be considered dissipation of assets. Carol asked what that meant, and Mary explained that if I could prove she'd been giving away significant amounts of our money without my consent, it could hurt her position in the divorce settlement. Ivy chimed in asking whether this meant they should start paying me back, and Mary snapped at her that they didn't have thousands of dollars just lying around to repay debts. Laura suggested that maybe they should just deny taking any money, but Carol pointed out that there would be credit card and bank records proving all the transactions. The really satisfying part was listening to them realize that their own greed might have sabotaged their plan. They'd gotten so comfortable taking my money that they'd created a paper trail of financial impropriety. Now they were scrambling to figure out how to minimize the damage. But I wasn't done yet. Tuesday morning, I escalated things further. I told Mary that I'd decided to hire a forensic accountant to help document our finances, since the separation was turning out to be more complex than we'd initially thought. I explained that my lawyer recommended getting a professional analysis of our spending patterns, asset valuations, and financial obligations before we proceeded with any formal agreements. Mary asked why we needed to go to such extremes for what was supposed to be an amicable separation. I reminded her that she was the one who'd insisted we involve lawyers to make sure everything was handled properly. I was just taking her advice and making sure I was properly protected. That afternoon, Mary's behavior completely changed. Instead of the supportive wife act, she became defensive and argumentative. She accused me of trying to turn our separation into some kind of hostile legal battle. She said I was being paranoid and vindictive, that I was letting lawyers poison my mind against my own family. We ended up having a massive fight in the kitchen, with both of us finally dropping the pretense of being civil about this separation. Mary accused me of being controlling and obsessive about money. She said I'd always resented her family and was now using this separation as an excuse to attack them financially. I told her that I found it interesting how quickly she'd gone from wanting an amicable separation to being angry about me protecting my interests. I asked her why she was so worried about a forensic accounting if she had nothing to hide. I pointed out that someone who really wanted a fair separation wouldn't be upset about transparency in the financial analysis. Mary shot back that I was being deliberately obtuse, that I knew perfectly well why she was upset. She said I was making this separation about money when it was supposed to be about our relationship problems. She accused me of caring more about financial advantage than about our family's well-being. That's when I decided to show a little more of my hand. I told Mary that I'd been thinking about our relationship problems too, and that I'd realized I had some concerns about the patterns I'd been seeing. I said I'd been noticing things that made me question whether this separation was really about growing apart, or whether it might be about something else entirely. Mary demanded to know what I meant by that. So I told her that my lawyer had mentioned that sometimes people initiate separations as part of a strategy to position themselves advantageously for divorce proceedings. I said I was starting to wonder whether our marriage problems were as mutual as she'd been suggesting. The look on Mary's face was priceless. She tried to act shocked that I would even suggest such a thing, but I could see the panic behind her outrage. She accused me of being paranoid and suspicious, of letting lawyers turn me against my own wife, but I pressed on. I told her that I'd been reflecting on some conversations I'd overheard recently, comments from her family about our marriage and our finances. I said I was starting to get the impression that there might be more planning behind this separation than she'd initially let on. Mary went completely ballistic. She started screaming about how I was accusing her of lying and scheming, how I was being completely unfair and paranoid. She said if I really thought she was some kind of manipulative mastermind, Then maybe we should just skip the separation and go straight to divorce. I told her that if that's what she really wanted, I was prepared for that too. I said my lawyer had already prepared me for the possibility that this separation might be heading in that direction. I mentioned that I'd been documenting things for months, just in case our relationship problems turned into something more serious. That stopped her cold. She asked what kind of things I'd been documenting. I smiled and told her that I'd been keeping track of a lot of things: spending patterns, family dynamics, conversations about our future. I said I wanted to make sure I had a complete record of how our relationship had deteriorated, so we could both be honest about what had gone wrong. Mary's anger turned into something closer to fear. She asked whether I'd been recording conversations without telling her. I pointed out that in our state, recording conversations in your own home is completely legal as long as one party consents. I mentioned that I'd installed those security cameras after the break-ins in our neighborhood, and that they'd been running continuously ever since. The color drained from Mary's face. She asked exactly what those cameras had recorded. I told her they'd captured a lot of interesting family conversations over the years, including some recent discussions about our marriage and our finances. I said my lawyer was very interested in reviewing those recordings as part of preparing for whatever legal proceedings might be necessary. That night, I could hear Mary on the phone with Carol until almost 2 in the morning. I couldn't make out all the details, but the tone was definitely panicked. Carol came over first thing Wednesday morning, and they spent hours going through the house trying to figure out exactly where the cameras were and what they might have picked up. Laura arrived Wednesday afternoon, and the three of them had what I can only describe as a crisis management meeting. They kept their voices low and moved around the house, trying to have conversations in spots where they thought the cameras couldn't hear them. But here's what they don't realize. Those cameras have been recording everything for 3 years. Every family gathering where they talked about my inadequacies. Every planning session about Mary's future without me. Every conversation about how to maximize their financial gain from a divorce. It's all documented. Yesterday, Mary tried a different approach. She came to me acting hurt and confused, saying she didn't understand why I was treating this separation like some kind of war. She said she felt like I was trying to trap her, like I was more interested in winning than in actually working on our relationship. I told her that I was just trying to protect myself, the same way she was protecting herself, by consulting with lawyers and planning her strategy. I said if she felt like I was treating this like a war, maybe she should ask herself why she was so worried about my preparations. Mary broke down crying, saying she never wanted things to get this hostile between us. She said she just wanted us both to be happy, even if that meant we couldn't be happy together. She begged me to call off the forensic accountant and the legal preparations to try to handle this separation the way we'd originally planned, but I could see right through the tears. This wasn't remorse about our marriage failing, this was panic about her plan falling apart. She was realizing that the passive, controllable husband she thought she was manipulating had turned out to be someone very different. I told Mary that I appreciated her concern, but that I was committed to handling this separation properly and thoroughly. I said I owed it to both of us to make sure everything was fair and legal, even if that meant involving professionals to help us navigate the process. Right now, I'm sitting in my office finishing this update while Mary, Carol, and Laura are having another emergency meeting downstairs. I can hear them moving around, probably trying to figure out damage control for whatever they think those recordings might contain. What they don't know is that tomorrow, the forensic accountant starts his review, and early next week they're all going to get a very clear picture of exactly what I've known all along, and exactly what I've been preparing for. The best part? They still think this is about a separation. They have no idea that I'm actually preparing to show them the door permanently. Phase 3 starts Monday, Reddit. And that's when they're really going to understand who they've been underestimating all these years. Final update. Reddit? I can barely contain myself right now. Everything I've been building toward for 8 years came together this week in the most spectacular way possible. The family that thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers just discovered they weren't even in the same game. Monday morning, the forensic accountant started his review. I gave him complete access to all our financial records, every bank statement, every credit card transaction, every investment account. What he found was exactly what I expected, and exactly what I'd been documenting for years. The report was devastating for Mary's position. Over the past 5 years alone, she had diverted over $60,000 from our joint accounts to support Carol and Laura. Money that was supposedly for household expenses had been systematically redirected to pay for Carol's car repairs, rent assistance, credit card payments, and shopping trips. Laura's medical expenses, home maintenance, and even her vacation costs had all been paid from our marital assets without my explicit consent. But the real kicker was what the accountant found in Mary's personal spending patterns. She had been using our business credit cards to make purchases that she then gifted to family members or returned for cash refunds that went into accounts I didn't know about. She had been systematically skimming money from our household budget for years, building up a secret fund that she probably planned to claim was her separate property. Tuesday, I sat Mary down with the forensic accountant's preliminary findings. I told her that we needed to discuss what this meant for our separation agreement. The look on her face when she saw those numbers laid out in black and white was priceless. She tried to explain that everything she'd done was for family, that she'd never thought of it as taking money from me. I told Mary that intentions didn't matter much from a legal standpoint. What mattered was that she had been converting marital assets for her personal use without my knowledge or consent. The accountant had classified this as dissipation of marital property, which could have serious implications for any divorce settlement. Mary tried to argue that the amounts weren't really that significant in the context of our total income over the years. I pointed out that $60,000 was more than most people made in a year, and that the pattern of deception was more important than the total amount. I asked her how she thought a judge would view her financial behavior when deciding on alimony and asset division. That's when Mary finally started to understand the position she'd put herself in. She asked what I wanted from her, whether there was some way to resolve this without involving the courts. I told her that would depend on how cooperative she was willing to be going forward. Wednesday, I moved into my new apartment. Not the modest place Mary had been hoping for, but a luxury two-bedroom downtown that cost more per month than many people's mortgages. I made sure Mary saw the lease agreement, with its hefty monthly payment that would reduce the amount of household income available for everyone else. But here's the thing, that apartment rent wasn't coming from my regular income. It was being paid from one of the protected accounts I'd set up years ago, money that was completely outside the marital estate. Mary didn't know this yet, but she was about to learn that the comfortable lifestyle she'd been taking for granted was built on financial structures she'd never understood. Thursday morning, I implemented the final phase of my plan. I activated the clauses in our financial agreements that I'd been keeping in reserve for this exact moment. The joint accounts that Mary thought she could access during our separation were converted to my sole control. The credit cards that Carol had been borrowing were canceled. The household expense account that had been funding Laura's lifestyle was frozen. But the real shock came when Mary tried to access what she thought was our emergency savings account, the account that she believed contained over $100,000 in readily available funds, the account that she was probably planning to use to finance her new life after our divorce. That account had been restructured 3 years ago into a series of trusts and investment vehicles that required both signatures for any withdrawals. Mary had been seeing statements that showed the balance, but she'd never tested her actual access to the funds. When she tried to transfer money to pay for her attorney's retainer, she discovered that her authorization level only allowed her to view the account, not to make any transactions. Mary called me in a panic, demanding to know what had happened to her access to our money. I calmly explained that those accounts had been restructured years ago for tax and estate planning purposes, and that her access had always been limited to emergency situations. I pointed out that consulting with a divorce attorney to plan the breakup of our marriage probably didn't qualify as an emergency under the terms of the trust. That evening, I could hear Mary on the phone with Carol and Laura, trying to explain that their financial situation had suddenly become much more precarious. The credit cards they'd been relying on were no longer available. The casual loans that had been supporting their lifestyles were no longer possible. Even the household budget that had been subsidizing their expenses was now tightly controlled. Friday, Mary made one last desperate attempt to salvage her position. She came to my new apartment, bringing Carol and Ivy with her for moral support. She tried to convince me that we could work through our problems without all the legal and financial complications I'd introduced. Mary said she understood that I was hurt about the money she'd been lending to family, and that she was willing to be more transparent about household expenses going forward. She promised that Carol would pay back everything she'd borrowed, and that Laura would start contributing more to her own expenses. She even offered to get a job to help rebuild our savings account. But I could see right through this last-minute negotiation attempt. She wasn't offering these things because she'd had a change of heart about our marriage. She was panicking because she'd realized that her plan to divorce me and take half of everything had just become financially impossible. I told Mary that I appreciated her offers, but that I'd lost trust in her ability to manage our finances responsibly. I said that I needed to see concrete changes in behavior over an extended period before I could consider reconciliation. I mentioned that my attorney had recommended maintaining the current financial structures until we could demonstrate a stable foundation for rebuilding our relationship. Carol tried to interject, arguing that I was being unreasonably controlling and vindictive. She said I was punishing the whole family for what she characterized as minor financial disagreements. I pointed out that Carol was hardly in a position to lecture anyone about financial responsibility, given that she owed us thousands of dollars and had never made any effort to pay it back. Ivy surprised me by asking whether this meant she wouldn't be able to go to college. I told her that her education fund was still intact, but that it would be administered according to its original terms, which required her to maintain a respectful relationship with both parents and meet certain academic standards. I said that the funding was designed to support her education, not to subsidize her mother's lifestyle choices. That's when Mary finally exploded. She accused me of manipulating our daughter and using money as a weapon against our family. She said I was being cruel and vindictive, that I was destroying our family over money that I could easily afford to share. I told Mary that she was projecting her own behavior onto me. I pointed out that she was the one who had been using money as a weapon, skimming from our household budget to control her family members and build her own secret reserves. I said that I was simply protecting assets that I'd earned from being misappropriated by people who had been planning to betray me. The conversation ended with Mary, Carol, and Ivy leaving my apartment angry and frustrated. Mary threatened to file for divorce immediately and fight for everything she could get. I told her that she was welcome to try, but that she should prepare herself for what the discovery process might reveal about her financial behavior over the years. This morning, I got the call I'd been expecting. Mary's attorney had advised her that given the forensic accountant's findings and the structure of our assets, pursuing a contentious divorce would likely leave her in a much worse position than trying to negotiate an amicable settlement. But it was too late for amicable settlements. I'd implemented the final phase of my plan over the weekend. The house that Mary thought she'd be keeping in the divorce was being transferred to the LLC that actually owned it, with new lease terms that made her a month-to-month tenant rather than a homeowner. The utilities and services that had been automatically paid from our joint accounts were being switched to require monthly manual payments that she'd have to make from her own resources. 20 minutes ago, I heard the pounding on my door that I'd been waiting 8 years to hear. Mary, Carol, and Laura, all standing in the hallway of my apartment building with tear-streaked faces and desperate voices. They were begging me to talk to them, saying they were sorry that they'd never meant for things to go this far. Mary was crying about the accounts being frozen and the house being in foreclosure. Carol was panicking about having nowhere to go and no money for rent. Laura was sobbing about how they had nothing left and nobody would help them. I opened the door just enough to see their faces clearly. These were the same women who had sat in my living room laughing about bleeding me dry and filming my life falling apart. The same women who had called me worthless and pathetic, who had planned to discard me like garbage once they'd taken everything I'd worked for. I told them that I was sorry they were having financial difficulties, but that I'd learned it was important to set boundaries in relationships. I said that I'd realized I needed to surround myself with people who valued me for more than just my ability to provide financial support. Mary begged me to let them come in so we could talk privately. She promised that things could go back to the way they were before, that she'd never ask for a separation again. Carol swore that she'd pay back every penny she'd borrowed. Laura cried that she'd never interfere in our marriage again. But I could see the calculation behind their desperation. They weren't sorry about planning to betray me. They were sorry that their plan had failed. They didn't want to reconcile because they loved me. They wanted access to the financial security they'd been taking for granted. I told them that I'd spent years trying to be the husband, father, and provider they wanted me to be. I said that I'd finally learned that some people would never appreciate those efforts, and that it was time for me to focus on building relationships with people who actually respected me. I closed the door on their pleas and their promises. After 8 years of preparation, their scheme to destroy me had instead destroyed them. The accounts they'd been planning to raid were protected beyond their reach. The house they'd been counting on was no longer theirs to claim. The lifestyle they'd been taking for granted was built on foundations they'd never bothered to understand. I can still hear them in the hallway, trying to figure out what to do next. 3 women who thought they were master manipulators, brought down by their own greed and their complete underestimation of the man they'd been living off of for years. Reddit? I won't lie. This feels absolutely incredible. They wanted to play games with someone they thought was naive and controllable. They learned that I'd been playing a much longer game with much higher stakes and much better preparation. The worthless, pathetic ATM they'd been mocking turned out to be the architect of their downfall. And the best part? Everything I did was completely legal and well within my rights as the person who earned the money they'd been so eager to steal. 8 years of planning, 8 years of preparation, 8 years of letting them think they had the upper hand. It was worth every minute.